Hey, this is Kamori, and for this video we're going to be talking about thread. Now, for your first introductory cosplay, you really don't need super fancy thread. For the most part, your standard all-purpose Coats & Clark polyester thread will work just fine. It's available in a huge number of colors. When you go to the fabric store, there's an entire wall of a whole bunch of different colors, like every single color imaginable of all different shades. So, when you get there, how do you decide which thread to use for your project? Well, what you want is for your thread to almost disappear into the fabric you're working with. So when you're selecting your thread in the fabric store, it's a good idea to either bring a little piece of the fabric with you if you're not going to be purchasing your fabric at the same time you're buying the thread. You can just cut a little bit of the piece and bring it along with you in your pocket and hold it up to the thread in the store and match it. So what you want is works really well if there's a little piece of the thread dangling off, but sometimes that's not always possible. So you want your thread to almost disappear into the fabric. If you can't get the exact color match, use your best judgment. You can either go a shade lighter or a shade darker. Personally, if it's a darker fabric, I like to go darker, and if it's a lighter fabric, I tend to go lighter with the thread if I can't find a perfect match. But that's really up to personal preference, unless you're Final Fantasy, where they use contrast stitching in everything. Because Final Fantasy. Okay. If you're going to be dyeing your fabric later on, you're going to want a thread that is made out of a natural material. For example, cotton thread, as that will take on the dye a lot better. Now, when you're storing your thread, you don't want to just let the end of the thread hang off, and then you'll end up with a giant mess if they all get tangled up to each other, and then if one of the spools falls off, then you just have thread going everywhere. That's really not a good situation. So what you can do is, in the edge of the spool, there's be a little slit that goes all the way around. So you take your thread and then hold it against it and slide it right in, and that'll lock it into place so you don't have to worry about it unraveling all over the place. Some of them have a slightly different slit in them. It has a little notch right in the end. You can go ahead and just take your thread and pull it in there. Now, for some reason, magazines that are showing sewing supplies have the tendency to do this thing where they just take the needle and stick it through. That's actually a really bad idea, because you end up just using the tip of the needle and slicing the thread and making it more fragile. And it's really not a good idea, and they probably only do it for cosmetic reasons. There's really no purpose to it. If you have to store one of your needles in your spool of thread, you'd be better off just sticking it in the sticker. It's not ideal, but it's better than damaging the thread. And speaking of the stickers, it's really tempting, especially when you go to put your thread onto the sewing machine, to just pop the sticker off. That's really not a good idea, because the little sticker on the end actually has a code for the color. So if you run out of thread in the middle of your project, you just bring the old spool with you, and you can match it up to the code on the wall in the store, and you make sure you get the correct color. And one thing to keep in mind, thread does have a little bit of an expiration date if you're going to be cosplaying using sewing supplies from an older relative who's been sewing for many, many years. Sometimes, just to keep in mind, test the thread before you work with it, because sometimes if the thread's old, it'll just become brittle and dry out and will snap easily, and you really don't want to use that for sewing, and then all of a sudden have your seams fall apart because the thread's just falling apart itself. And that's about it for thread.